Plants, especially herbaceous plants, such as grasses and forbs, are the most important part of a watershed and are critical to their recovery after fire. Without herbaceous plants, water runs quickly over the surface of the ground, carrying with it soil and causing erosion. Rapid surface flows damage rivers and streams and exacerbates flooding. Without plants, water doesn't percolate into the ground as readily, so underground water storage areas dry up. With plants, water slows down as it moves across the surface, infiltrates and replenishes underground water storage areas, so it is available to grow more plants and recharge rivers and aquifers. Plants protect the soil from erosion and excessive heat and create a healthy underground environment to grow more plants that fuel ecosystems. Beyond plants' role in maintaining healthy watersheds, herbaceous vegetation form the basis of life for people and animals. Let's dive into the importance of plants to our watershed and how we can help restore them after a fire or really any time.
So herbaceous vegetation allows water to seep into the ground, and they're the first species to respond post-fire. Many of the wildflowers are ones that need to be exposed to full sun in order to bloom, in order to germinate. And many of the species have been under a very thick forest canopy for decades. The seeds can stay dormant for decades, but in the wake of a fire, the canopy is opened and all of those seeds are triggered to germinate and get established. Their role is to get established quickly, early, and then to reinvigorate the whole ecosystem, to attract pollinators, to attract birds, all kinds of invertebrates and then vertebrates. The wildflowers are typically the first, and we saw that in the wake of the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire. The wildflowers, the sedges, pine sedges, were some of the very first plants to get started, even in June, July of 2022. And then these native grasses are quick to follow on behind them. Again, with the canopy opened up, the sun hitting the ground, that stimulates them to put on new growth. And many of them haven't had enough sunlight to seed productively in years, and so their job right now is to grow quickly, to produce seed, and to attract and invite all of the fauna back into the environment. So every plant has a different role. There's this complexity of different habits of growth. Some plants are going to have a very conservative amount of growth above ground, but might put on a large storage taproot that pulls resources down deep into the soils. There are grass roots that are designed like a straw that takes precipitation and pulls it down deep into the root system, where it can stay stored away from the fluctuations of soil temperature at the surface. Basically, we have this wild mosaic of all different plants having a different habit that help cover the soil in lots of different ways and pull the resources down into the soil and pull up resources. We also have all of these plants that are so well adapted to utilize the immense amount of nutrients that are suddenly available from all of the ash. So those plants pull those nutrients into the plant body and keep them from washing downstream into our watershed and drinking water supply. So carbon sequestration just means that plants are doing photosynthesis and working by building plant bodies. That is our best, most realistic approach to carbon sequestration in the arid Southwest because of our mineral soils. The role of plants is to put on a lot of biomass and therefore hold carbon in their bodies. In wetlands, we can see carbon sequestration happening in soils, but upland slopes, former forests, a lot of the carbon sequestration that we're going to find is going to be through plants building their bodies through putting carbon away that way. I've found that making seed purchases for restoration, it's really important to work closely with a seed house and ask a lot of questions. So the key questions are, which of these species are in fact native to the location where I'm working? Some seed houses will try to make substitutions with other species that are similar but that are actually not native to the area where you're working. So if you're trying to build a native seed mix, especially with native grasses, a good move is to confirm that all of the species in fact native to my working area. Then I always ask, is this seed supply, this lot of seed, the closest that you can provide as a seed vendor to my geographic location? A lot of times seed houses are able to pull seed from areas that are actually more local to our environment, or that are going to be better suited, that might be lower elevation than where we are now, and so are able to have a lead compared to lots that might be collected in Colorado or Kansas, where there's a lot more moisture. It's always important to find out whether there are any weed species in the seed mix. So ask for the seed certification. Ask if there's any weed seed in the lots that you're ordering, and if there are noxious weed species or any weed species, ask what those species are, and then do a little research. Find out just how difficult to control is that weed if it is going to be part of the seed mix. There are some weeds that are already widely present in New Mexico, and so those might be of less concern. We don't want to be in the position of introducing new additional weed species into our watersheds. That would be an additional hurdle for us to cross later. There are weed-free seed lots for sure. You can ask for weed-free seed lots and whether they have any available. You can also order seed from different seed companies and have them shipped to a single seed company that you're working with for them to be mixed together. So that's often a barrier that some people perceive, is like, I wanted to include these species, but they're not available from the main seed house that I'm working with. You can have the other seed companies send seed to the main seed company that you're working with and get everything mixed together. Cover crops are used in a restoration scenario sometimes. They're not these days generally perceived as necessarily beneficial. Cover crops should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and that we should assume that they don't need to be included, that native species should be the primary, sometimes the only, seeding that needs to happen. When cover crops are determined to be used, it would be because there's a fear of just so much bare ground and a desire to get a grass species established that's going to produce a large root in the first season, and that provides soil stability, especially for slopes. Also, those annual grasses that are the main constituent for these post-fire cover crops, they're able to pull a lot of those nutrients that are in the ash into their bodies right away and keep them from going downstream. So those species are things like sterile triticale, which is a hybrid wheatgrass that is not supposed to produce viable seeds, but it has all of the benefits of producing a lot of above ground and below ground biomass, so roots that are going to help stabilize the soil. The main thing is triticale is a very standard post-fire. We've also been seeing crested wheatgrass. Crested wheatgrass is often not very viable. It's related to the wheats that we grow for food. It is similar to our western wheatgrass and other native species, but it's also an annual. It's going to produce some seed, and there's a possibility of that persisting over the years in our ecosystem. It's going to provide a lot of high nutrient seeds that are available for turkeys and wildlife. when you're making a decision about whether to do cover crops or not, I think that it's important to evaluate the likelihood of persistence in the ecosystem, and then the value that that cover crop is going to provide in terms of soil stability and wildlife. So oats are something that Hermit's Peak has been using alongside native post-fire seed mixes, and the oats are helpful. They're quite affordable. They can be sourced within our nearby region, and they're a grain that both the grain itself and the leaves are palatable to livestock and wildlife, whereas the triticale and the crested wheatgrass don't appear to be so palatable, especially because the crested wheatgrass and the triticale have these long awns. That doesn't mean that they are not playing an important role. The difficulty with oats is that they really do like a little bit more water. All of these grains that I'm mentioning are ones that are going to germinate in the fall and grow off of winter precipitation and be finished with all of their seed production by the summer solstice, so before rains arrive. So that's nice because you have all of this, grass mulch that lies down ahead of any of the monsoon rains. Well, we have Curtis and Curtis and Bamert, and they both do a combination of farming native seeds and doing wild collections or collections on properties around the region and storing those seeds and making them available for the retail and wholesale market. So those are the two ones that exist with New Mexico addresses. Granite Seed is another supplier that I've worked with, and I think that, again, it's all about establishing a relationship with an individual rep who you can provide the project location to, and they're not going to try to redirect your project priorities to match what they have available. They're going to listen to your questions and respond with appropriate, and you can always double check whether their recommendations are appropriate by talking to folks who are here working on these issues locally. So I think that when we're talking about post-fire restoration, it's best to focus on areas that are disturbed, bare ground, and not steep slopes. So the tops of terraces, areas that are a little more flat, ideally places where there is some woody material, whether that's felled trees or standing dead that's going to provide some shade. So the places to focus are not the hardest to achieve, not the steep slopes that have lost soil or places that have, or were already a road or a rocky slope. Don't expect those places to be ones that are good for revegetation. Instead, focus on areas where you can get a hold with establish a population that is from seed that will then help grow down those slopes over time and will keep the soil that's at the top of the slopes in place. The trade-off with introducing seed that is the same species of what's already present or has historically been present is that the plants that you're introducing are going to grow plants that will hybridize, will cross and influence the genetic adaptation that the population has to this location. So grasses are wind pollinated, and that means that if you're seeding in an area that has a very highly adapted population and you're seeding in something that's been grown on a farm in Kansas, but they're the same species, they're going to cross, and the resulting population is going to be probably somewhat less adapted to the exact place. So that's the kind of trade-off. Seed timing is pretty important. In general, late summer is a great time to seed. Going into milder temperatures, a lot of species need to be exposed to some cold winter temperatures before they're going to germinate. So in the second, third, fourth season is when we're going to see more and more of the seeds that go in year one germinate. So late summer's always a great time. Just before snow and just before a first big snow is a great time. Next best could be in spring, in March, April, if there's no snow on the ground and we know that there's still snow anticipated. That's a really nice time to seed, is just before we get a nice snow. Snow is really good at doing the job of raking seed into the soil for us. And so that will both protect the seed from blowing away, washing away, and will help provide some of those conditions that help stimulate seeds to germinate. So that is a trade-off. When it could be really beneficial to seed in March or April ahead of a snowstorm, but don't seed in March or April ahead of a windstorm. Like, the high winds of spring can really pull off the soil that maybe you tucked over the seeds, and wind erosion can be a real force to move seed out of the places where you intended it to be. I would not recommend seeding in June, because we're talking about when the soil is driest, and so all of the raking that's required alongside seeding is going to loosen dry soil. And then we're talking about, our first heavy rains potentially. And so that can just take the seeds right down the slopes with the first rains, especially in a post-fire environment. So after a few rains, once there's some soil moisture and the fines that have accumulated on the soil surface are maybe rearranged, the next best time would be after the first monsoon rains, but when we're expecting monsoon rains to continue. Seeding mechanically, you can use a conventional agricultural drill. Native seeds are much smaller and often fluffier, and a lot of conventional farm drills are designed for smooth seed that's going to flow out easily. But conventional farm drills can work if you mix the native seeds with enough of a smooth flowing material, like rice hulls, which are an inert material. They're just going to add biomass. There's an additional cost for those, but you can get them mixed right into the seed mix. It's going to make your seed mix take up a lot more volume, and you're going to end up paying more on shipping to get seed. But it's an option if you're determined to use the farm seed drill that you've already got on hand. Restoration no-till seed drills like the Truax are designed to be able to handle very small seeds, fluffy seeds, and smooth seeds. They have a different box with a different seed agitator for each type and each seed shape, geometry. And so those Truax and Truax type range seed drills, no-till seed drills, are going to help treat dozens to hundreds of acres with minimal impact, without requiring bare ground for the seed to get good contact with the soil. There are seed broadcasters. They're kinds that you can put on the back of a tractor, that you can put on the back of a UTV, ATV, and those are going to broadcast seed out onto the ground. You could then follow that up with a UTV or tractor pulling a rake to be able to cover the seed up a little bit. Those are all approaches that would allow you to cover many more acres, but the acres need to be accessible, and how much damage are you going to do in terms of creating roads and tracks. Seeding by hand is totally feasible. Seeding by hand, you can cover per person easily 10 plus acres in a day with a decent, appropriate seeding rate. And if you time it right, then you can minimize the amount of raking that has to happen. Raking is really crucial, but with good timing, you can kind of minimize some of that. When you're seeding by hand, there are these handheld seed broadcasters that are really designed for spreading fertilizer. I just would encourage you to always use the crank on the lowest setting and check the condition of the seed that comes out, because some of those break the seed when they're passing through the mechanism. So some of those seed broadcasters can be a bit hard on the seed itself. They work well for some people, but a lot of the native seeds are so lightweight. You can cover, half an acre with one 5-gallon bucket of seed. So that weighs, 4 pounds. So not so much weight that you might need a big piece of equipment. The native grass seed mix that Hermit's Peak has been using is designed to be sown at a rate of around 16 pounds per acre. And that translates to something like 20 or 30 seeds per square foot overall. So that's a light broadcast by hand, something that you can see on the ground after you've been through, but where you're not seeing dense patches anywhere. The grasses have that kind of 10 to 30 seeds per square foot. The forbs, the wildflowers, are going to have a much lower seeding rate, on the order of a couple seeds per square foot. That's because the seed is so much more valuable, so much more expensive, but also because that's the arrangement in the ecosystem of forbs. There's going to be, a few per square foot. With the cover crop species, a heavier seeding rate is fine, so something closer to 30 pounds per acre. That's a lot of cover, and 10 pounds per acre would still get you a lot of good cover with something like oats. When we're heading out to seed, we're going to usually include, in our case, oats. We'll make the first pass with bright, light-colored seeds that you can see. You can walk fairly quickly and put handfuls of seed out. Maybe a handful every 3 or 4 steps is going to give you the kind of cover that we're looking for. With the native grass mix, we're talking like take 5 or 6 or 7 steps for every handful of seed that goes down. And wildflowers or forbs, we want to put down a handful that's going to cover a very large area, maybe 20 steps for every handful of seed. So we're heading out with 3 different buckets of seed. We're going to have, our cover crops, our native grasses, and our forbs, and we're going to put all of the seed down before we then make our pass to rake it all in. Make sure everything's tucked in under the soil and has good contact with the soil. Seeding is not for the faint of heart. Seeding is a good approach to help in places that are in greatest need. So where there's really disturbed bare ground. So what you can expect is that the most willing species might show up in the first season. The most species you're not going to encounter until year, say, 4, maybe 5. And that's because they need to be exposed to the right conditions to be stimulated to germinate. These are not your garden cucumbers that just need 3 or so days of consistent water to be convinced to germinate. These seeds need time and all of the right conditions, and they know to not trust a few good days of rain. So have patience. You don't need to continue inspecting the soil looking for the seeds, but if you know that you've had real soil loss in an area, real soil erosion, that would be the time to consider reseeding. However, I'd suggest that you try to take some other erosion control measures. If you've got an area of rapid erosion, then that's going to call for additional treatments more than just using seed.
being a tiny seedling is stressful when you're exposed to the full sun, and so mulch provides a tiny pocket of shade to the soil that is going to be covering where a seedling is going to grow. So it's a tiny pocket that protects the soil from direct UV light and from the heat that happens to the soil surface through direct sunlight. It also holds additional soil moisture and breaks down and helps with soil associations with the young seedling for a lot of species. So woody mulch is going to turn into a surface for fungus in the soil to grow on that's going to help make it more likely for a grass plant to survive and do well in its first season. A lot of things can be mulch. So mulch, the wild mulch that we find is the plant matter from last year's plants and every year before. When we need to create that same effect, we can do that with straw, and I do recommend trying to find weed-free straw. So look for straw, which is should be just the stems. Wood chips are an option because they are also a carbon. They're a little more resistant to blowing away in a wind. But when wood chips are too thick, then the seeds are not able to experience light, and even the wood chips can cut off the soil from getting a lot of light soil or light moisture that falls as snow and might sit and just evaporate back into the atmosphere. Rock mulch is another thing that, with our restoration structures, a lot of times we're talking about putting just placed rocks on the surface, and that can provide shelter for young seedlings. So it's a good idea to, if you're going to be doing a rock structure, to include seed, especially if you're doing this in a totally disturbed bare ground sort of situation. Okay, so I'm going to start with the oats, and I'm going to choose my outside line and walk along that first, because I'm going to cover the whole area by doing passes back and forth, and each pass I'm going to cover roughly the same width. For me, that means that I'm going to cover about an 8 or 10 foot wide swath, and I'm going to get 3 good shakes across that width. So next we'll do the native grass mix. So this is a lot more seed than I need for this area. I'm going to use a small amount of this, but I'm going to do it a handful at a time. And some things about working with native seed in a bucket, broadcasting seed, you can inhale it. You shouldn't inhale it. I think it's smart to wear a mask or something. Some people will even have a reaction to some of the grasses and grass parts. So it could be a good idea for a lot of people to wear maybe nitrile gloves and long sleeves, because you want to be able to feel the seed. So you don't want to have big bulky work gloves on, but something that might protect your skin from having an allergic reaction to so much grass. Go back to where I started. Just like with trees, more is not better, right? If you plant too densely, then you'll have too many grasses in too small of an area competing for the same resources, so that it might look greener at first, but then all of those plants are going to tank, in the heat as soon as that stress comes along. So it's best to give the plants room for the resources that they're going to need to grow all the way to becoming mature. So you can see the oats, but you can't distinguish the native seeds so much. But we want to do a light raking with this. There are some native plants already germinating in here, so I'm going to do my best to not disturb all of them and uproot them since they have made it through so much already. So we've seeded and we've raked, and it helps to spread some straw. So I'll show you what I'm going to. Could be any straw that doesn't have wheat seed. What you're trying to imitate is a little duff from last year's grass when there is no last year's grass. So that's going to provide a little shade, a little protection from the surface, from the impact to the surface of rain, and it's going to help hold soil moisture in around the plants as they germinate and establish.
In conclusion, restoring diverse native herbaceous plants is crucial for watershed recovery after a wildfire, benefiting ecosystems, wildlife, and human communities alike. To effectively rejuvenate these vital landscapes, focus on planting and nurturing native, weed-free grasses and forbs in areas with bare soil, while managing livestock to prevent overgrazing and promoting plant regrowth. Additionally, control invasive species by removing them and minimizing soil disturbance. These steps represent the most cost-effective approach to restoring and sustaining watershed health.